Innovation Officer at Schneider Electric. Thanks for being here. It's a great pleasure to be at WebSummit again this year. A lot of things happening, especially around how the world becomes more electric and more decentralized, more digitized, and more decarbonized. And with me, I have today Mike Doucleff. How are you, Mike? Good morning.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Emmanuel. Mike Doucleff. I'm head of our electric mobility business at Schneider Electric. I'm happy today to share with you how the transition to electric vehicles is playing a major part of the energy transition, as well as all of those new opportunities that it's creating. So let's get started. We're starting on time here, Emmanuel. Let's kick it off. Let's start at the big picture. Let's talk about the trends and tell us, what are the trends driving the energy transition? Share with us, Emmanuel, what's accelerating this transition to renewable energy.
Yes, Mike, this energy transition is going to be about demand. It's going to be about us as consumers, as businesses, in the way we change what we consume as energy, going from fossil fuels to electricity, and making sure that this electricity is produced and stored in a sustainable fashion. It's not good. That's not going to be a supply revolution, because all the energy transitions that our civilization has gone through have always been driven by the usages, by the demand, by how human beings and societies were using technology. So it's not going to be about supply. It's not going to be about tweaking the current large supply chain of energies from one to many with very centralized system that's going to make it. So of course, replacing fossil fuel power plant by a solar plant or wind farm, that will help. But if you look at the evidence and the numbers, that won't be enough to keep us below the 2-degree target of the Paris Agreement. What will really change in the next decade is how we use energy, what we do about it as consumers and businesses. And what we start seeing in many places in the world is businesses asking companies like us, Schneider Electric, to help them get a better price of electricity, producing themselves their energy because it's too expensive on the grid, having more resiliency, especially in places where the grid is fragile, and last but not least, having a more sustainable electricity. So people want to be in charge of their energy and want to control that part, and might want to make sure that they not only do a good job for the planet, but also for them as businesses. Same in our homes. More and more storage is being installed in many houses, replacing gas-powered backup generators, and more people are becoming aware that electricity is important in our lives, and it doesn't cost us much more to do it. Even it's going to cost us less to produce it ourselves and store it ourselves. And one of the big accelerants of this energy transition is how we are going to switch our habits around transportation. How progressively, and maybe not that progressively, we are going to move to electric vehicles and electrical transportation. Mike, can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start with where we are today in terms of this transition from internal combustion engine vehicles or ICE to battery electric vehicles or BEV. If we look at the adoption at the end of 2019, in the consumer side, there was only about 3% of vehicles worldwide that were electric. And by the way, half of those were in China. So if we look at 3%, you can say it's still a relatively small number. And we're still in the early stages of adoption, but that's actually been a 10x increase since 2009. So 10x increase, 10 years, but again, only around 3% adoption on the consumer side. Now, the next 10 years are going to be the interesting ones. If we continue on that trend of a 10x, it means by 2030, we can have somewhere in the range of 30% of vehicles in the world being battery electric. So what's driving this adoption? First, on the consumer side, it's about the battery. Now, inside the battery, you have 2 points. The first one is the cost. The battery is one of the largest components and cost drivers in an electric vehicle. So as the battery cost curve continues to come down, gets to a down $100 per kilowatt hour, well, then you're going to have price parity. Today it's more expensive to buy a battery electric vehicle than it is an internal combustion engine vehicle. Of course, governments are there, and subsidies are there to try and offset that cost, but there's still a discrepancy in the cost. The second point around the battery is really about the range and the range anxiety around this. This is what you can read about and hear about today in the market. But that's getting solved. And pretty soon, we're going to have a mass market vehicle with a range of 400 to 500 kilometers. So when you think about the battery, it's about the cost curve and it's about the range. And then that's going to be the sweet spot. That's going to be the inflection point when we have a price parity for the consumer with a range of 400 to 500 kilometers. Now, when you think about that, in most consumer use cases, when you have a range of 400 to 500 kilometers, well, the charging behavior is going to be different than probably you think. It means that in the future, you're probably not going to be stopping to charge as you do today. Today, we put molecules into our cars. Tomorrow, we'll put electrons. Probably we won't be stopping to charge, but it means we'll probably be more charging when we stop. And where typically we stop in most use cases is three places. That's at home, that's at work, and that's at destination. Destination could be commercial center, retail center, grocery store, etc. So what that means is if you're charging when you stop, it means for buildings, we're going to need more electricity in our homes, at our workplace, and at our destinations. And not only are we going to need more electricity, but we're going to need more energy management. So building owners, homeowners are looking at how to support EVs through these means, energy management. We can also think about, as you mentioned, storage, the integration of solar, etc. Now that's about the consumer. When you look at the fleet, now the fleet is converting much faster today than the consumer. And the reason is that the economics are already there. The return on investment is already there for fleets. And that's because it's 10 times cheaper to run or to, let's say, fill the vehicle with electrons than it is molecules. So 10 times cheaper to power a BEV versus an internal combustion engine. On top of that, there's 100 times less moving parts in a battery electric vehicle versus internal combustion engine, which means virtually there's zero maintenance or very low maintenance. And it means that you can essentially drive an electric vehicle for 3 times as many kilometers as you can an internal combustion engine vehicle. So the economics are there for fleets. It's cheaper to fuel, and you essentially need 3 times less vehicles than you would internal combustion engine. Now, the implication on that is really at depot, so where these fleets are going to charge, and fleet could be taxi, ride sharing, could be bus, could be a commercial delivery vehicle. These fleets, when they charge, they're going to have high energy needs at the depot level. So that means we need to rethink the utility feed, but more importantly, we need to rethink about energy management, microgrids, storage, solar, and really think about designing these depots in a way that are future-proof. As we adopt more and more electric vehicles, we're able to fuel them. Another implication at the depot is in the delivery fleet. Imagine delivery vehicles are coming to load packages for dispersion on the last mile. At the same time they're charging. Well, you have a lot of process automation, very electric intensive. You have charging of vehicles, very electric intensive. And that equation requires a bit of energy management and thought around it. So let's switch gears and talk about opportunities for new business and technology. And Emmanuel, I know you're talking with a lot of startups, large corporates, both new and old companies, and both sides are building solutions to meet these changing needs. So what are the opportunities that you're seeing today when you're speaking with all of these companies?
Well, Mike, if you want the future that you were just describing to happen, that future of electrification, where we will fundamentally change our relationship to energy and to electricity, the way we fuel and power our cars, and where that electricity is coming from, and how we make that world more resilient and more sustainable, that will require a lot of innovation. So large companies like us will definitely contribute to this, but that won't be enough. Incumbents or large large corporations are very good at optimizing a lot of resources that they can put to the service of innovation. But that's never enough. You really need to engage with startups, with entrepreneurs, with an ecosystem of people who don't have any legacy, and people who can help those corporations do the extra mile. This is what we call the Innovation at the Edge program. We have the innovation at the core. This is the first order of business through R&D to create a lot of innovation for our customers. But you need to implement this with this Innovation at the Edge program, which is basically about learning from other startups, listening to what's happening, trying to help the startups who are creating future technologies or future business models, help them grow and grow with them and create and co-create and co-innovate together. And I see, for instance, I'm keeping an eye on the chat here. I see a lot of those entrepreneurs who are connecting the dots with what we are saying, and then would definitely like to engage with them. Would it be around AI, around how you recycle batteries, how you make the production of batteries for EVs more and for homes more sustainable. So to do that, we have this Innovation at the Edge program, which is basically about engaging with startups, about collaborating with them. Today, we are collaborating with more than 200 startups across the world, and sometimes investing in some of them. And again, we have a huge power of innovation, but that's not enough to create that future we are describing here. This is why we invest and work with others. And in the field of the energy transition, which is the one we are discussing today, I could mention companies like Station A. Station A is that company that just with satellite images is able to tell you how much electricity your roof would be able to produce if you were putting solar panels on it, and how to organize the solar panels. And that's fairly important for large businesses. Or Natel Energy, which is also creating a new life for hydro, for micro hydro energy, because when we think renewables, usually we think wind and solar. Well, guess what? Hydropower is also renewable, but if you make it, you have to also make it very sustainable in the way you apply it. Not about building huge dams. It's about micro turbines that can sit in the bed of rivers, that are fish safe and completely sustainable from the get-go. Or software, like AutoGrid, which is basically the company that's helping the grid stay alive in that world of highly decentralized energy resources, where everybody is constantly uploading and downloading electricity from the grid, and you have to constantly rebalance and organize the different loads on the grid. All those innovations that Schneider Electric is bringing to the market and that are fueling these energy transitions are actually coming from entrepreneurs, from real entrepreneurs and companies like the one I've mentioned. What we do also, we create companies from scratch internally with an incubation. We take an idea and we literally create new businesses. We do that usually 5 times a year. And this year we just launched, for instance, Green Structure, which is a new company that is selling microgrid as a service to small and mid-sized businesses in the US. Mike, any examples on your side in electric transportation for the startups we are collaborating with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's still a new market, as you said, 3% adoption in 2019. So there's many opportunities for both entrepreneurs to develop solutions and also for businesses and companies to build competitive advantages. So maybe let's start from the entrepreneurs. I'll give just 3 examples quickly of what we've seen recently. If we go back to the battery, right? Remember, the battery was the important piece of the electric vehicle, and there's a company, Titan AES. And what Titan AES has figured out is how to have a much more accurate state of charge of the battery. And you may think, why is it important to know exactly where the battery is? Well, today, we don't have such a good idea of the real exact state of charge of battery, which means that even if our vehicle may say that I have 10% remaining. In actuality, there's a buffer built in. So maybe really I have 30% remaining, as the technology isn't very good today to give us that exact state of charge. So what Titan has done is figured out how to know the state of charge better, which means that with the same existing battery, we can essentially use it for further range without further investing in the size of the battery. So really interesting what they're doing at Titan. And then if we think about buildings, again, we're gonna charge when we stop, and when we stop, that's typically going to be where there's a connection to a building. Well, there's some interesting new business models, and there's a company called Volta, and what Volta does is really interesting. They offer charging to the consumer for free. Okay, and they're installing their charging sites at typical commercial and retail, sporting event type of venue. So it's free for the consumer. They actually install the chargers for free, so no charge to the building operator. So you think, okay, well, Volta is giving away energy to consumers for free and giving away charging stations and keeping them operating for free. Where do they make money? Well, they make money from revenue. So they're essentially, they make revenue from advertising. So essentially, they're getting revenue from the advertisers who are putting advertisements on their screen. And what Volta has been able to do is really, get this model in with all those large property owners and place the charger in a clever spot that's very attractive for those advertisers. So very interesting, model where everybody's kind of winning. Then the last example, which is more in the fleet space, and that's DST, Dishangxia, which is a company based in Shenzhen. And DST has really gone on this jumped ahead on the first adopter for getting this ROI in a fleet. So they're operating today 30,000 electric logistic fleet vehicles as a service. Okay, so it means they're competing with the traditional players who have 30,000 diesel commercial delivery vehicles, for example. And what they're gaining is a better operating expense because, again, it's 10 times cheaper to fuel an electric vehicle with electrons versus molecules, and there's virtually no maintenance, which means that you only need to have one for every 3 internal combustion engine vehicles. So DST, again, is doing deliveries for large commercials, for large delivery services, and they're able to do that at a better price. So really interesting example for entrepreneurs. And then if you look at businesses or companies, and what are they doing? Well, they're adding EV charging to attract customers, but also to attract employees, and also to meet their sustainability targets. So very interesting that, what we see with buildings, for example, buildings are adding energy management, they're adding microgrid, and they're adding all of this capability to be able to then build out electric vehicle charging stations. One example, a well-known one in Europe is Lidl. Everybody must know Lidl, a retailer which is operating in several markets. And Lidl is essentially offering charging sessions to their customer. So they're using that as a way to attract customers to their locations. If we look about fleets, again, fleets are electrifying to reduce costs, but also, of course, to meet their sustainability commitments, to be carbon neutral, needing cheaper, reliable, low carbon electricity in order to provide a competitive advantage. And an example here, a big name, Coca-Cola in Norway, they're doing 2 things. One thing, they're providing electric vehicles to their employees, okay? And they're doing that. Well, first of all, if you're an employee in Norway and you have a company vehicle, if it's not electric, you're gonna raise this thing. So you essentially have to provide them with electric vehicles. So they're providing charging for their employees at work when they're at their office, but also at their homes. So they're doing this as a way really to both meet their sustainability goals, but also to attract and retain employees. Okay, so let's conclude with maybe one last question, and this is really more around the speed of the energy transition, and it's for you, Emmanuel, and then of course we can answer some of those questions in the chat. But some people are saying that the energy transition from burning carbon to renewables will take a long time, right? Since the last one lasted around 100 years. What do you think, Emmanuel? Is it going to be another 100 years for the next transition, or how do you see that? I
don't think so. This one will be fairly fast for 2 reasons. This energy transition is relying on 2 main enablers. One is batteries and the battery technologies. And for the last 10 years, we have seen the emergence of electrical vehicles everywhere, and together with this, huge improvements in the battery technologies. There are a lot of investments by all type of corporations around the world, and with all the automotive industry switching to electric vehicles, this innovation, this innovation in batteries is just accelerating, and it's also making the price of lithium-ion batteries decrease at an exponential pace, right? So you almost have a kind of Moore's law in batteries. Yep. So that's the type of speed this is going at. And the second enabler is software. It's completely possible to have an entire city with 90% of decentralized energy resources or more, and having the grid stay afloat, right? So without what we would call a base load. The condition to do this is software. So those two technologies, batteries and software, are providing an acceleration to that transition that will make it happen probably in no more than 10 to 15 years, maybe less than this. And again, it will be a lot of about how we use energy. All right. So I think that transition will be very similar to the transition we lived in the last 10 years around the usage of compute power and the fact that today, well, we carry in our pockets 1 or 2 mega computers, and this just happened in a few years. So that transition from burning stuff to fuel ourselves and to heat ourselves and to provide energy to the world, to stop burning anything will probably happen in the next again 10 to 15 years. And in that process, we will consume much more electricity, like probably twice as much electricity as we consume today. But that's okay, because that electricity will be much more sustainable, much more abundant, and because it will be produced everywhere. We may have more electricity than what we need at some point because of that multiplicity of decentralized energy resources. But that's okay, because producing more electricity will not entail creating more carbon emissions. It will be just basically going to almost free electricity and carbon-free, completely carbon-free electric system. That won't take 100 years this time. It's probably more than like 10 to 15 years max. And again, it will be on the demand side, right? So today, 80% of the renewable power capacity is installed in buildings. It's not about big solar farms. It's, of course, big solar farms are very important, but it's mostly about decentralized electricity generation.